Okay, now moving on to Quintilian and what you should be looking for with respect to his texts. And again, the Institutes is 11 books long. I know people who've read it all cover to cover, and I suppose if you're stuck on a desert island, you might want to do that. But frankly, it's much better to sort of skim and pick out, go across the surface of it, pick out the things that are really the most important for our purposes, simply because it is a huge, huge text. And what we've got here with the Matson text is some highlights from it. But there's much more to it than what is in this anthology, and I do encourage you to go and take a look at it. Of the 11 books, we're getting a sampling, as I said, of all of the major ideas that are put forward, but also to sort of give you a feel for the character of it as well. So be on the lookout for that. The key goal here for Quintilian is to offer up a complete manual for the training of the orator. And yes, it takes 11 books to do that, evidently, according to Quintilian. Quintilian, early empire after Cicero, probably the second most monumental figure in Roman rhetoric, and he is thoroughly in the empire, whereas Cicero straddled that era between late Republic, and early Empire. Quintilian was thoroughly in the empire itself. He didn't know anything other than having an emperor, for example. And so that raises some interesting questions, which we'll get to in just a moment, about an orator in an empire with an emperor. Um, and so, what we want to talk about, especially when we're reading Quintilian, when we get to class in our face-to-face class, we're going to want to talk about rhetoric during the empire itself, the decline in the political arena. And we talked a little bit about this previously, and I'll talk about it more when next we meet. And that is, what is the function of deliberative rhetoric when you don't have a deliberative body that has the same power it once did? When an emperor is making all the decisions, do you really need deliberative rhetoric? Well, yes, you do, but more on an administrative level than on a policy making level. So, I mean, taken to its extreme, do you really need to have a legislative body when what you have is a dictator in charge? Well, I suppose so. Rome wasn't exactly a dictatorship all the time, though it was to a great extent. Under some of the emperors, they pretty well told the Senate what to do. The Senate was a rubber stamp or a whipping boy even when it got bad, but there were other times when the Senate reasserted itself and said, no, we have jurisdiction in some of these matters, and some of the emperors were more than willing to let them have their sway. But it never was the same during the empire as it was during the Republic as an important deliberative body, the Senate. Not that it was terribly representative of the people's will anyway. It was mostly a representative of the will of the most prominent families in the Republic. So rhetoric largely takes a different turn. It becomes more of an academic exercise. It becomes more of a philosophical pursuit. It becomes much more concerned with the ceremonial and the artistic. So epideictic rhetoric becomes much more celebrated. It becomes a thing that one does in school and in the public square and on special occasions. And of course, it does still remain very important in the law courts to prosecute, for example, criminals, or to have a lawsuit waged against someone. You still have to know that, but it becomes truncated to some extent. Now, his fixation on educating what he calls the perfect order, yes, he does say perfect, which is quite astonishing. His desire to educate the perfect orator is a chief focus of the text. He draws from Cato, and I want to stop here because every time I do a PhD examination, and a student says, and I ask them, what does Quintilian mean by the perfect orator? They always say the same thing: the good man skilled in speaking, or a good man speaking well. And there's several problems with their answers sometimes, and I'm hoping that those of you who take this class don't fall into this kind of ditch in a way. And that is, number one, he doesn't even get that. He doesn't even come up with that on his own. He gets that from Marcus Cato, all right? And so that's Cato, his ideal, good man skilled in speaking. But the second thing is that that's not as simplistic as you think it is. People say, oh, you got to be good, you got to be a good person, and you got to be skilled in speaking. The whole treatise or set of treatises is all about this really difficult question of trying to resolve what precisely that is, what precisely that means. So, number one, it's not his phrase. And number two, he doesn't just plop it out there and say, oh, you got to be a good guy and you got to be good at speaking. That's easier said than done. So he spends an enormous amount of time, and we'll talk about this, we'll look at some of the key passages when we get into the class, uh, talking about what it means to be a good man, what it means to be skilled in speaking. Those are very, very open-ended questions, and he's got to get around to all of that. Well, in the process of doing so, we find, and you'll find as you get through this and you turn a few pages, that he is very much an Isocratean, just like Cicero, who believes strongly that the orator needs to learn the science of speaking well. And now, the Latin term here is scientia, which means a way of knowing, okay, or knowledge. But it's quite different from the term ars, which means an art. It's not an art to Quintilian. It is a science. There are right answers. It's not a matter of style and individuality and verve and all these kinds of things. No, no, no. It's about finding the right. So to him, when he uses scientia, that's a pretty bold thing, because you don't see Cicero talking about the science of speaking well. He doesn't. So this is really new for Roman rhetoric, and it's very Quintilian-esque in a way. One of the big things that we've got to focus on when we talk about this face-to-face is the question of whether or not the success or effectiveness of a rhetorical piece is to be judged either internally or externally. Clearly, Cicero believes that the measure of a speech is how well it convinces the audience. But Quintilian is going to say, no, the audience is important, but it's not the ultimate arbiter of whether or not the speech was effective. The speech was effective if the speech put forward the right things and did it well. If you're arguing in front of a bunch of knuckle-dragging, drooling barbarians right out of the hills, and they don't understand or appreciate it, that's not your fault. You're under no obligation to pander to the mob. Now, this is really interesting because, of course, Quintilian doesn't live in an open and free society with free speech. Not that Cicero entirely did either, but that's a different story. But, think about this. Suddenly, that standard changes, and there's a really good reason why it has to change, and that is that it no longer under a dictatorial system, under not an authoritarian system is probably a more appropriate way to put it. Under an authoritarian system, it's no longer as important to persuade masses of people, because masses of people don't get to make the decisions. And you can understand why Quintilian would feel the way he does in terms of wanting to satisfy himself and the educated elite with having made a good speech, and not so much the uneducated mob, which was an unruly bunch that wanted bread and circuses, as the phrase goes, throughout the later Roman Empire, and got nastier and uglier and stupider as they went. He does go on about how the orator has to be a good man, and that he must use rhetoric to defend the truth. When we get to Augustine, you'll see what Augustine does to this. So put a little book note there, a little note to yourself, a little post-it note there to say, once we get to that passage here in Quintilian's Institutes, be sure to bounce it off of Augustine when we get there, because that's going to be an important thing. Remember, we talked about euhemerization and all of that, and Augustine is going to have to say, well, should we or should we not, as Christians, use rhetoric? And he's going to take a page from Quintilian's Institutes to do that. He offers examples throughout the text. If you've read it, you've already seen this, of handling the three types of speeches and the canon. So he goes all the way through that. It's a very, very comprehensive piece. And he also makes these arguments. Now, this is where we're going to really spend some class time this week, I hope. He really makes this interesting argument that bad men cannot be good orators. They can't always be effective because they can't always succeed in deceiving. In other words, for a while they may win the day, or they may give a speech that moves some people to do some bad stuff, but bad people cannot be good orators all the time. Think of the Lincoln quote, you can fool some of the people some of the time, etc., etc., etc. We'll see what you think of this, because this is probably one of the most controversial aspects of his whole notion of ethics and the orator. Living post-20th century, I think we are a little more skeptical of that question about whether or not bad people can can succeed all of the time. Maybe they can't succeed all of the time. Maybe eventually they won't succeed. Maybe eventually they will be discovered for the deceivers and the evil people they are. But eventually is a long time sometimes, and they can do a lot of rotten things and influence a lot of people to do a lot of bad things in the short run. We'll get to that when we get to the ethical discussion of it, but be on the lookout for that as we get into the institutes, and that comes towards the end of that selection as well, especially.